for History of Economic Thought. So what I will talk about today is, I want to, first, any questions before I get going? Last time we lectured, I introduced Adam Smith, and I just gave a little bit of his background, but I talked about how he's from the Scottish Enlightenment, and one of the questions they deal with is this question that comes from Bernard Mandeville. Mandeville writes The Fable of the Bees, The Grumbling Hive, and it is seen as saying that selfishness is good, ethics bad, and that's scandalous, and people are trying to sort out, trying to respond to it. And many of these, Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, and others are writing in response to this, and we're going to talk now about Smith's response. It's partly what his theory of moral sentiments is. But remember that Smith has this idea that he wants to, all of his work is, not all of it, but all the work along these lines is devoted to trying to say, what is it that makes a society work versus a society that doesn't work? What are the secrets, or what are the keys, or what can we say about it? That's what he's getting at. And he thinks that ethics is crucial, economics is crucial, law is crucial. This is the ethical part. And so, theory of moral sentiments. And he's going to be talking about, first of all, he's going to be talking about human nature, and he's going to be talking about the development of civic ethics and self-government. And by self-government, he doesn't mean picking your leaders. He means how do you govern yourself, and how does a group of people get along with each other and govern themselves? What are the things that are going to hold that together? And his argument ultimately is going to be that it is, first of all, you could say civic ethics. You could say it's a culture or a component, a part of culture that deals with that. But it's how people are going to treat each other and relate to each other, and this becomes crucial for him. And he also thinks that human nature is given. It cannot be changed. There are variations in how people learn and what they do, but the fundamentals of human nature, basic nature, is fixed, it's permanent, and humans have an innate moral sense. So he's going to lay out his theories about these things. Various characteristics, though, of humans can be developed, and that can be done for better or for worse. And so we'll try to lay this out. Okay. Now, I guess the first question you might even ask is, great, this is History of Economic Thought. What does this have to do with economics? You know that in the novel Saving Adam Smith, Smith is coming back to haunt economists because they've forgotten his theory of moral sentiments. And one year, students were reading this, and one student said, I kind of enjoyed the novel, but it's kind of far-fetched to think that graduate students in economics don't know about theory of moral sentiments. My response to that is, I would be shocked, truly shocked, if 10% of PhD candidates in economics had ever even heard of theory of moral sentiments. I'll be astonished. I think it can't possibly be. Nobody knows about this in economics. That was if that was the part of the novel that you found not believable, boy, you're so at any rate, economics, though, is about human choice, right? It's about human action. Well, how do people choose? How do they decide what's possible? How do they decide what's desirable? And mostly we gloss over those things in economics, but Smith is not glossing over them. That's in essence what he's focused on here. What do they think is how do they behave, and what do they think is desirable? That's going to tell you something about what kind of society is sustainable. So let's get on with it here. And Smith starts out, I put a little list here, so we've got human nature according to Smith, what are the moral sentiments, how does that link to civic ethics and institutions, and finally a very short bit on what does this all imply for the role of the state or for government. And that'll be obvious when we get to it. And this will seem not like an economics lecture in a way, and I suppose in some ways it's not, but it's the backdrop. And so let's start out with human nature. And Smith begins by saying, human beings are social animals. Okay? Humans always live in groups. They always live in societies. We are individuals. We are naturally individualistic in that we focus on ourselves, but we always live in societies, in groups. I try to think of, whenever I think of something and read something, try to think of the opposite, and like, what is this compared to what? When I think of animals that don't do that, first thing that comes to my mind is a grizzly bear. At least in the ones that I'm familiar with, tend not to like each other. They compete for land, for food, for territory, and they don't get along. They live as isolated individuals, except when they come together to reproduce or fight. Humans are different. We build societies. We always do this. There are very few true isolated individuals. Now, the thing about humans is that we are self-conscious. We're aware of ourselves as beings. We're also aware of each other as what we think are similar beings. And Smith observes we have this innate natural interest in other people and in what they're thinking. It's just the way we operate. And also in how other people feel and what they think of us. But we cannot actually see that. We don't know what people think. I mean, you guys are pretty easy to read because you actually communicate with this 1 o'clock group. They sit around and they're just, I sometimes think, wow, I've got a bunch of automatons in here, zombies, I don't know what they are. But what we do is we look at behavior and then we infer from that what we think people must have in their heads. Something along those lines. How would we feel if we were in that person's place, given what we see? And Smith says we are, in this sense, spectators. We are spectators of each other. I'll just put down spectator. And what does a spectator do but observe, but watch people? And we observe someone. Here's a little schematic. We are watching a person, we see each other, and we observe, first of all, there's some sort of an event or a circumstance. Something happens, and it triggers in someone an internal response, and Smith calls that a sentiment. Okay, that's internal to the person. So you can think of that as a feeling or a judgment or something like this. So you can think of the sentiment as be internal. It's in the mind. It's not observable is the key part. It's a person evaluates something. They think, oh, this is good for me. It's bad for me. I'm happy, unhappy, inspired, threatened. It's evil. It's good, something. Okay. The role of emotions might fit into this. But we can't actually see that because what we actually see instead is a passion. And this would be the expression of the sentiment. The way that people respond in some sense. This is observable to the spectator, to us. And then that in turn gives rise to action. People act accordingly. And so that also is, of course, observable. And so for Smith, we observe these things, and then we try to figure out what these are. And we do that through what he calls a process, or the capacity for empathy. And empathy would be the ability to, I guess I'll say, ability to infer or judge sentiments. From passions, to try to understand other people. That's how we understand each other. Okay? To understand each other, we observe the passion and the action, then we put ourselves mentally in their place to understand the sentiment. So I look at you guys and I look at your faces, and I see you're looking in a certain way, and I think, I take that to be a look of brilliant concentration. Was I right? Yeah, good. I was going to say puzzlement, but then I thought that sounded better. Whatever it is. or excruciating boredom or pain or something that I'm inflicting, that I think, well, maybe that's what I'm inflicting on you, but whatever it is, I try to infer, or I look at people and this is how we behave. Okay? Great. And then Smith says, our judgment about this is what he calls sympathy. The extent to which, the degree to which we agree or think it's appropriate is the extent, that's our extent of sympathy. Agree with the sentiment that we have inferred from someone. Great. So we're learning. We're looking at people. That's what he means by the spectator, and we're judging. And so we can make judgments like, well, was that an appropriate response? Was it not appropriate? Was it too much? Not enough? Just right? Did they get carried away? Are they, do you think it's admirable or ideal or not? And says Smith, it's not just other people we do this with, but also with ourselves. We can observe our own behavior and do the same kind of thing and start saying, am I behaving properly? Do I think my behavior is correct? And so he comes up with the idea that we can not only do this as a spectator, but what he calls the impartial spectator. And he treats this as if it's a person or something like that, that's or a role that we take. But really it's a capacity that he thinks we have. So we're self-interested. So we're self-interested. We're not only interested in what other people think, but also in what other people think of us. We desire certain responses. We tend to like people to be aligned with us, to share our ideas, our emotions, our reactions, our viewpoints, and things like this. And so Smith says, using this impartial spectator, we tend to temper our own behavior to make it more communicable to more understandable to other people. Okay, you don't just totally get mad, you don't just totally fly off the handle, well, maybe you do, but only when you think it's really appropriate. You try to govern yourself in such a way to be coherent to other people. And in part, that's learned behavior. In part, that's culture. And we're going to come back to those kinds of ideas and why that might be relevant. But this impartial spectator includes the ability to observe, I guess we should say, well, it's obvious to, it's supposed to be impartial, to observe and judge one's own behavior and control it then in ways that are generally thought to be appropriate. Self-reflection. To adjust it and to engage in self-reflection. And people might have different capacities for this, but this is going to be, for Smith, quite an important thing. Okay. And he's going to lay out what ideal would be and then talk about how we might approach it sort of imperfectly. And why would it be imperfect? Why don't we just do this perfectly? And Smith says, well, we have all kinds of internal and external forces working on us. And so this is just one thing that we have. And there are other things that will interfere with it. And what are some of those other things? And he says, well, for one thing, there's passion of the moment, or there's emotion, or there's other kinds of feelings that will impact us and disrupt this. I'll give an example here in a second. Another one is honest ignorance. We can just be confused about things. And another one is self-deception. And Smith says we're all so in love with our own characters in some sense. We always tend to justify ourselves. Even the worst criminals will say, really deep down, I'm a good person. I just had to do it, or it's not my fault. And Smith puts it this way. He says, love of the honorable and the noble, the grandeur and dignity and superiority of our own characters is something that's embedded in us. We all just deep down think we are right. Okay? Great. And so we have that to some extent. And so let me give you a couple of examples of the things that can trip up or at least mean that the impartial spectator doesn't just rule or govern. And one of them is to think about differing kinds of sentiments. And they might actually either conflict or they might be intermingled so that they're kind of working together. Here's an example of them kind of working together. And Smith has this idea that we have a hierarchy of interests. The hierarchy of a person's interests, and it begins with self-interest. Number one is, this would be for a typical person. Now think of this as being an average person's interest. Self. That's what you're first most focused on. Your self-interest. And then next, probably, for most people, it would be the immediate family members. And then next, for a lot of people, it might be the more remote, what would we say, extended family and friends. And then after that, maybe passing acquaintances. And then after that, maybe some other kind of groups like Smith uses fellow countrymen. So other Scotsmen or other Englishmen. Or maybe some kind of other groups that you're a member of. I don't know, you're all Hillsdale students. So you meet some Hillsdale student you've never met before. Oh, wow, great, we have at least that much bond, and so, something like that. And then finally, foreigners in Smith's layout. Hang on. And what you see in this is that with increasing social distance, the farther you away are from the self, the weaker that bond, the weaker the benevolence. So it starts out with self-interest. We're looking at self-interest and interest in others, benevolence, being kind of combined. They're kind of combined here, but the benevolence is getting weaker and weaker as we go farther away from the self. Okay. Great. In fact, Smith says, when you get down here, it might even turn from benevolence to malevolence. You might actually, foreigners, I hate foreigners, or I hate this particular group of foreigners, or whatever it is. Okay. Great. Kind of makes sense? That's his idea of how the social distance thing. And we'll come back to this, why that one might be at the top. I guess there's an obvious connection there between self-interest and interest in others, but there's also other kinds of conflicts. So, for example, he has the earthquake example. You all know the earthquake example? It's mentioned in Saving Adam Smith. 10 million Chinese. 10 million, here's the story. Smith uses this example. He says, suppose that something happens. A man is told 10 million Chinese just died in an earthquake. And at the very same moment, the man's little finger is cut off. And Brianna, why did that make you smile? she don't say it. We don't want to know. She looked terribly amused by that, though. Anyway, he's just lost his little finger, and Smith says, look, 10 million dead people is the greater tragedy, but the man is going to be running around screaming his head off about his finger, even though that's the bigger tragedy. And why is that? And he says, it's because the man is focused just on one thing, and there's no chance for the impartial spectator, wherever he went. The impartial spectator requires cool reflection, and there's no cool reflection because of the immediate pain of that. But then Smith says, suppose instead we have this scenario. The man is told there's going to be a disaster in China. It will kill 10 million people, but it could be stopped, but it would require you to lose your little finger. And Smith says, a benevolent person would immediately say, take my little finger to save the 10 million. Okay? Great. Everyone agrees? Great. I told the other class that this class would probably say, get rid of the Chinese, save my finger. Anything to wake those guys up. But at any rate, well, Smith says any benevolent person who has the chance for cool self-reflection, in that case, the impartial spectator can work well. Okay? But we don't always have that. We've got all these different things impinging on us. Okay? So it's imperfect. It conflicts with different kinds of feelings we have. It's just one of our capacities. Okay. All right, well, great, but so what? Well, how do people conduct themselves? How should people conduct themselves? And what does all this imply then for a society? Okay, well, let's think about that, or what Smith says about that. So while I erase questions, if you have any, just ask them, because I'm not looking at you. Let's get them out of here. All right, well, maybe I could have left that one out, but this is good. Let's move to the moral sentiments and what they are. The moral sentiments, and once again we have this story, that an event occurs, the event, something happens, and that triggers within a person sentiments. That's some sort of an evaluation or internal reaction. And the sentiments then trigger passions, which are the expression of the sentiments, okay, the expression. Not observable, observable. And so Smith says there are three kinds of passions. And so the three kinds of passions, the three fundamental categories are the unsocial, the social, and the selfish. Okay? Okay. Which are the good ones? Which are the bad ones? Anyone want to hazard a guess? And in fact, Smith says all of them are important. They all have their place, but they have to be kept in proper balance. The unsocial, the social, and the selfish. How can the unsocial, well, let's see. How can an unsocial passion be good? Well, what are we even talking about here? And let's start out then with the unsocial passions. The unsocial passions would be things like hatred and resentment. How could those possibly be good? Anyone?
Hating something bad.
Hating something bad. That's exactly right. In its appropriate place, this is necessary, says Smith. I always think, whenever I talk about this, I always remember Murray Rothbard, who I actually got to meet several times. Austrian economist, famous guy. And Rothbard was very, very funny, but Rothbard was, and he talked like this. Hatred! Ah, I love hatred. Hatred is good. I hate Hitler. Stuff like that. And he was even more amusing than I am. But at any rate, hatred and resentment. The question is, what's the underlying sentiment? As Smith says it is, the underlying sentiment is, it's a desire for justice. It's a desire to be treated justly. That is, the principle underlying it is justice. Okay. Great. And people direct those things against, they're not necessarily bad because they protect us from being abused by other people. But, says Smith, if those things are not checked by the impartial spectator or something else, those are potentially the most destructive. Because if they're unchecked, you become a Hitler. You do, nothing will stop me. I'm going to crush anybody who I dislike. And so potentially very destructive. Smith puts it this way: too much renders a person the object of universal dread and abhorrence, who, like a wild beast, ought, we think, to be hunted out of all civil society. That's a person you can't live with. That's somebody who's enraged, Antifa rioter who just goes out and smashes, or a Hitler or somebody who just wants to destroy. Because they're so engrossed with that. Okay? So, limited, properly balanced. What it has to be balanced with? Other things. How about social passions? And the social passions are I guess, obvious things, but those are things like, love, friendship, generosity, kindness, compassion, etc. I can put a whole list. Humanity, these are things that Smith lists. And those are good. I mean, obvious, I guess. Those things represent underneath them the underlying sentiment, says Smith, that gives rise to them is what he calls beneficence, or we can say benevolence, but good feeling towards others, caring about others. And Smith says that those are the source of the greatest pleasures for human beings. Okay? Friendship and love and kindness, friendship and love, for example. Those are the best. But, says Smith, they also have to be checked because too much makes one weak in character and helpless. The kind of person that others will just walk all over. And so, again, it has to be properly balanced in his view. And then finally, there are the selfish passions. And the selfish passions would be just emotional things like joy, grief, happiness, etc. Just put that down. And underneath the underlying sentiment is self-love. So what about this one? And Smith says this one is absolutely necessary. Without it, we would not take care of ourselves and we would not survive. It's necessary because each of us is an individual and we have to care, we are ultimately caring for ourselves. Without this, we'd die. Ronald Coe says that if Smith had the theory of evolution, he'd just say, without that, we'd be evolutionary dead ends. We'd die out. Okay? And Smith puts it this way. He says, every man is, no doubt, by nature, first and principally recommended to his own care. And as he is fitter to take care of himself than any other person, it is fit and right that he should do so. Every man, therefore, is much more deeply interested in whatever immediately concerns himself than in what concerns any other man. And so this principle right here is actually quite important. It is I had that hierarchy. It started with self. That's not a bad thing. That's actually a necessary thing and a good thing. You have to be interested in yourself because you are the one who knows best what you need and what you can provide for others. Nobody is in a better place to govern than yourself than you are. So that principle right there will get you doing it right. Of course, you're focused on yourself, first of all, and as long as it's balanced with these other things, good. Okay? So again, the little finger in the earthquake story makes sense because the man can't do anything about 10 million people dying in China, but he can at least protect his finger or do something about that. Okay? It makes a kind of sense. You can it's interesting to contrast this with Immanuel Kant, who says that Kant, in his idea of the imperative, a moral principle. If there's any self-interest involved, it can't be moral. Smith doesn't agree with that. Smith's got a different view. Okay. Great. All right. Well, good. Those things need to be balanced. And again, given our physical natures, we have to be balanced like this. So Smith says all three of these passions are necessary. All three of the underlying sentiments are appropriate if our passions are properly checked or balanced. And so too much, not enough, not good, but the right amount, good. And the impartial spectator and self-control are important. But we have all these, human imperfection means we won't be able to follow this perfectly, and therefore we're going to need rules and institutions which will also help to guide us in this sort of thing. And if we get these things right, we'll have a successful society, and to the extent we don't get them right, we'll be less successful. Great. So, clear so far? We'll come back to that in a minute. Questions? Well, here are a couple of things about, let me say something about beneficence and justice, because there's an asymmetry in these things that Smith points out. Let me show what this is. He's going to draw some kind of important conclusions from this. And so imagine, let's think of them as being an absence of justice and an absence of benevolence. And compare those two situations. We'll see there's something different about them. Because for Smith, an absence of justice means that you can point to a positive evil that is being done. Positive evil, what do you mean? I mean a positive, an actual action. A positive evil. You can actually point to, oh, well, look, a crime has been committed. Somebody's rights have been violated. Somebody's been murdered, robbed, raped, attacked. Something bad has happened to someone. That's a violation of justice. Right? Some sort of an attack or something wrong was a real injury has been inflicted on someone, a violation of rights, something like that. And if you see that, that implies there is a role for police power. There might be a role for the state to intervene. Police, military, courts, something like that, right? Because something bad has been done, and there's an appropriate response using force to stop that. Okay? Great. Rectifiable by force. What about this one? Absence of beneficence. And there is no positive evil. It's just that you imagine good could have been done, but it wasn't done. A good action might have been done, but it wasn't done. And as Smith says, there's no end to imagining good things that could have been done, that maybe could have been done, that weren't done. We can imagine infinitely many things, and it's just, it's not that something was done to someone, it's just that you think that something else could have happened. No positive evil means no role for police power. No role for a violent response or something like that. Great. I guess you can't, say properly, you can't compel people to be good. You can compel people to take actions, but that's not the same as being good. So Smith's already getting some ideas about what the role of the state is from what he's laying out here. In modern terms, you guys know what negative rights are? Negative rights versus positive rights. You ever hear this language sometimes used? The idea of negative rights, again, a weird way of maybe expressing this, but that's things like you can't violate other people's freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of action, things like that. That is to say, leave people alone. Negative, that's the notion of negative rights, like the Bill of Rights. On the other hand, positive rights would be things what are sometimes, I think, inappropriately called positive rights, would be things like entitlements. You have a right to health care. Yeah? How much? If you're going to say that people have a right to health care, how much? What's the limit? Is there a limit? Well, I don't know. These are really entitlements. They shouldn't even be called rights. But they kind of fit into those categories that Smith has laid out. Not his terminology, but you can kind of see what the connection is. This positive right, negative right kind of idea comes from political science. Anyway, great. Okay, good. Well, there's the first kind of little, I guess you say not digression, but a corollary that comes from this. And there's another one that Smith develops from this. And that's that he says, the lack of justice triggers in people appropriate, we hope appropriate, resentment. If they see bad actions occur, they're upset, we hope. And they demand that, they don't put up with it. They demand something be done or they do something about it themselves. They see injustice being committed. He says that's the ultimate safeguard of a free society, or the question about what can be done in a society, whether it works or not. What will people put up with? It isn't ultimately the police and the formal system that puts society together. That only helps. If people, generally speaking, won't put up with injustice, you won't have injustice. And if they will put up with it, it doesn't matter what the police do. And so Smith says, resentment is the safeguard of justice. It's what is in the hearts and minds of the people that will be the ultimate source of the justice, if any. And the police and the state are not the ultimate source. They only strengthen and support it. It's civic culture that ultimately matters. And that's also true then for beneficence. And he thinks that for a liberal, a free society, proper moral sentiments is the key. That's the thing that will guarantee it. And so this brings us up to civic ethics. Have you ever heard of this idea before, about the importance of civic ethics or these kinds of ideas? Has anybody ever heard anybody express this before?
In high school, I had like a civics class, and somebody talked about it.
Okay. Your high school teacher said it?
Yeah.
Good. Who else?
A lot of the founders say that you need a virtuous people.
All of the founding fathers, so far as I know, said this. Who else said it? Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it, and he said that's why we didn't do so well in the Soviet Union. Ludwig von Mises says it. Who else I put on my list? Ayn Rand says it. Larry Arnn says it. You guys ever hear of Larry Arnn? I think anybody who's thought really carefully about the way that societies work, to me, begins to hit on this notion that what are the ideas of the people are the ultimate bedrock. And that's what Smith is getting at. That this idea of civic ethics is crucial. Okay, great. All right, good. Well, let's move to that. And so we'll say civic ethics and institutions. Institutions, what are those? And of course, by that we mean the rules, the fundamental rules that are holding a society, that govern a society. Yeah, we're good on time, good. Well, so here's what we've said so far, what Smith has said so far. And the first is that humans have this innate moral sense, and then they're born into a society they have an innate kind of human nature and a moral sense, but it develops. They pick up, they learn, they pick up ideas about what is good and what is bad to various extents through experience and education. And we also have the ability to judge for ourselves, okay, to make our own evaluations of these things. And so Smith thinks that that both individuals and societies can develop and evolve. And I've got a schema here that sort of shows this, and again, maybe this will help, maybe it won't, but events occur, or circumstances of some sort. And they give rise, of course, to sentiments, and sentiments then to passions and all this stuff, but we get to actions, okay? Events lead to actions. Actions lead to consequences. And as economists, we know consequences include the intended and also the unintended and perhaps completely unexpected. And great, then what? Well, that gives us our next set of events and circumstances for our decision-making process. So this is kind of a stylized schema. I'll say something about it. When this, so let's say this applies to a person, just an individual, is confronted by some set of events or circumstances, takes actions, and then gets consequences. That person then learns. So we have learning. And then we have additional, external events, which set up the next, say, decision problem. And the person now makes a new set of choices and actions and so on, and get more actions and more consequences. And we have a process of learning and development going on here. Okay, it could be an individual learning in school. It could be, this could apply to almost anything: material, ethical, intellectual. But it could also be a society, how a society is developing. This occurs, people act in certain ways, those actions combine to generate consequences. Everyone learns something, and the scenario continues, and the way they behave changes. Okay, so this can become a model for how, for example, institutions evolve. And so for Smith, we see this process, and we get change, and we get evolution, we get progress. Now, when Smith says progress, he doesn't mean that it's necessarily getting better and better and better. It could be getting worse. It just means that it's changing. Okay, but we get a process of change going on. So it might be desirable or might not. And Smith says, if societies grow, if they grow, we tend to see the following stages of development. And Smith's stages are these. He says we would start out, human societies start out as hunter-gatherers. So tribes living in the wilderness or something like this, African Bushmen, maybe the Plains Indians or something like this. But then they move next to the nomadic and herding stage. The Maasai of Western Africa, Eastern Africa, unless they got lost. And what then? Agricultural state. And then, says Smith, after that comes modern 1759 Britain. So that's where we have reached, as he says, the commercial state. Great. So increasingly complex societies with increased division of labor. And it's not certain that that's going to happen. But if it does happen, they need increasingly complex rules and institutions to hold things together, to show people how to operate, or so that these things will work. The hunter-gatherer society just needs a few simple rules. They need a lot of really complex rules, including contracting and all kinds of things. And informal institutions will be the bedrock, and then we've got the formal institutions on top of that. So formal institutions. Again, institutions mean rules of the game. So the formal institutions would be things like constitutions and laws. Typically stuff that is written down, doesn't have to be, because it could be common law or something like this, but stuff that's written down. And then there are also the informal institutions. And informal institutions, you could say culture, at least parts of culture. You could say, mores, and let's put it this way. It would be things that are rules embedded in people's minds and behavior. Okay, great. And, in fact, I'm going to do a little bit more with this. There's a, you can, the way that Smith thinks of this is that the fundamental bedrock would be the informal institutions. And atop that, I'm going to draw a pyramid here. The next level is the formal institutions. And atop that, kind of the superstructure that these things will support would be the makeup of your society. So things like, he will talk about the extent of the market. That is, how much of a market system can you sustain? What kind of technology can you sustain? Can you operate? What kinds of contracts will be possible? How big of a commercial system? What kind of an economy can you have? Well, it's going to depend first on this, which will give strength to that, to that. And hopefully those will reinforce those. The formal will reinforce the informal and not contradict them or sabotage them. Great. Without informal institutions, though, the formal ones won't have any choice, any force. Okay, what do we mean by something like that? Soviet Union. Did you know that the Soviet Union guarantees everyone a whole bunch of, their constitution of the Soviet Union guaranteed everyone a whole bunch of different freedoms and rights? It didn't stop a single person from being sent to the death camps and the gulags. Okay, millions of people died there, but they had the formal institutions. Or people like Douglas North or the Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto have asked this question. Why is it that so many South American countries copied the US Constitution and then got totally different results? And both de Soto and North say, after studying it, they think it's because we learned our informal institutions from English common law, and they learned theirs from Spanish mercantilism. And they don't live the same way, even though it's the same constitution. Or why does it turn out that when we go to Iraq and we say, great, welcome us, please. We just invaded, here you go, here's democracy. It'll work just like in the US, right? Well, it turns out it won't. Because we can give them the formal institutions, but the formal institutions of a tribal cultures might be quite different and not use those things in the same way. Do you get different? That's the fundamental thing in Smith. And it seems to make sense. Great. So how people learn to behave and what they expect from each other is fundamental here. Okay, great. One other thing I should say about that, I've been talking about Smith talking about human nature. And he sees human nature as being a constant. It's given. Now, there can be variations in it because we learn different ways of operating. But it isn't changing human nature when we see progress. We're still fundamentally self-interested. We're fundamentally governed by those passions and those things. I mention that because before too long, we're going to see some other thinkers where they will say that progress means we just change people. We just re-engineer them. We change human nature. It'll be totally different. People will never be self-interested again. They'll only care about the proletariat or something. And we'll kill the ones who don't cooperate. But we'll see that from William Godwin. We'll see it from Owen, Robert Owen, Saint-Simon, Fourier, Marx, Lenin, Mao. And we see it today actually with the World Economic Forum saying, maybe we could just change human nature and we'll get a different society. Okay, so this stuff is, I'm contrasting Smith with these kinds of other views, and we'll see that coming back. So keep those in mind. Wow, okay. Where do informal institutions come from? Because it turns out that that's really important, and Smith thinks, well, you can't centrally plan them. You can't sit down and design this. Where do they come from? Thoughtful reflection is not sufficient. Smith says, immediate passions magnified by self-love will overwhelm our judgment, and we're not smart enough anyway. we're not aware enough to design these things. How do we get them? And Smith says we have nature's remedy. We learn from each other. These things are spontaneous in a sense. They just sort of crop up from the way that people began reacting to each other, and then it develops. Often we pick these up. So Smith says we care about what other people think, we observe each other, we get feedback, and we behave accordingly. I might try something here. I don't know if I will. We'll see. An experiment. But Smith says, oftentimes for many people, their only sense of duty is what they learn from the bulk of mankind. They just do whatever everybody else does. How many of you are Sunni Muslims? Nobody raised your hand. And that's because you all sat down very carefully and read the Quran and then read all the Sunni authors to see how they commented on it, and you decided, no, I don't write. Any of you do that? No? How many of you think you probably picked up most of your religious ideas from your parents? Probably. If I had asked this question in Saudi Arabia, everybody would have gone like this. And if I'd asked it in Iran, they would have gone, Sunnis, kill them. Well, whatever. I mean, Smith's right about this. Where do we get most of our ideas? This applies to all aspects of society. It's not just political economy. And Smith says fashion, dress, things like that. So for example, when do you smile? When is it appropriate to smile? Not right now, I'll tell you that. I knew I could make people smile, some of you. When is it appropriate to smile? I was in Russia, and I was talking to Irina Tokarenova, a friend of mine who was doing a PhD. They have this weird discipline, which is it's really a Russian or Soviet thing. It is a cross-cultural comparative PhD in comparative culture or something like that. It's not a field that we really have here. It's sort of like, it's not quite like sociology. It's just different. But basically, they would pick two different cultures and they would become specialists in comparing them. And there were a number of people who were like that in this program. But I was talking to her. The interesting thing about her is that her comparison was US culture and Russian culture. And she wasn't either one. She was an ethnic Buryat from, the Buryat people are Mongols who live east of Lake Baikal. And she'd grown up in a Buryat village in this kind of more Sovietized Mongol culture. And I was talking to her, and we were going on. I said, Russians are so weird. Yeah, they are. No, I said, Russians don't smile at normal times. I said, Americans just smile naturally, but Russians have all had that kind of stomped out of them. Russians don't smile at normal times. She just goes, you guys all think that about each other. You're all wrong. Everything you guys do about when it's appropriate to smile is what you learned. It's not natural to smile at the time any of you do, or to not smile when you don't. It's just natural. And at first I was thinking, that can't be right. And the more I thought about it, and the more I watched, and the more I traveled in different cultures, yeah, it's just learned behavior. When do you smile? You learned it. What's the proper, I don't know how is anyone here really terrified of coronavirus besides those of you with a mask on? If I try, if I try an experiment, is anybody going to be upset? I don't know. It's failed almost every time that I've done it recently because I make the big mistake of just picking the wrong kind. But I do have a question. What is the proper distance to stand from somebody when you're talking to them? So she did, in fact, flinch. Okay. I tried that actually with somebody. Usually that works just like that. But I did try that with somebody one time, and I go up, and the guy suddenly just becomes totally rigid and doesn't move. And suddenly I realize he just got out of the military, and I'm acting like a sergeant. And he's just totally like, okay, but that's also learned behavior. What is the proper distance? I was traveling in West Africa, and people basically that's about how far people would stand from each other talking. Or there are cultures where it's like, what is the proper distance? 6 feet, something like that. But that's all learned behavior. Nobody sat down and taught. What's the proper number of, when you're talking to somebody, how often do you touch them? Just acquaintances, or probably not very much. There was a study that was done in an international airport where they were watching couples, just observing them without the couples knowing. And they said that with American couples, they might touch each other twice a minute when they were talking. And French couples, it was like 100 times a minute. And Italians were just kind of something like that. And the English were kind of like this. Well, it's all learned behavior, though. It's like, those are never things that you sit down and think, what's the appropriate? You hardly would ever think that. Okay, but that's what Smith is getting at. And that also applies to civic culture and how you treat people and what you expect from them, and things like that. So society is an extremely complex thing. It can't be artificially constructed. You can't create the new Soviet man and have him be what you want it to be, as we're going to be talking. And you don't hold it together by force. Force will only help a little bit, but it won't hold it together if there's no social glue, so to speak. And so it's voluntary cooperation, informal institutions, and it will be facilitated or sabotaged by the formal institutions. And hopefully you'll be lucky and born into a society that gets this right and not one that is dysfunctional. And I guess as I'm telling Russian stories, I might as well say that one of these cross-cultural PhDs that I was talking to was talking one day and just talking to some of the American faculty and saying something about maybe sort of his background to this. Understand that, as far as I could tell, this person who was talking did not like Americans and did not like America, and had spent a lot of time in America and was very pro-Russian. But was talking and said something about, your culture works and Russian culture is dysfunctional. And a couple of my American colleagues said, oh, no, don't say that. Don't say that. You have such a beautiful country. Jesus, come on. Russian culture is dysfunctional. I love Russia, but come on, be honest. It's dysfunctional in many respects. There's certain things about it that just, maybe that's why she didn't continue with this, but maybe that's why we get gulags and you didn't. But at any rate, so Smith thinks that culture matters. It's not just going to be free market or something like that, but the free market will be an enormously important part of it. All right, good. So maybe summing up this little bit on institutions and informal institutions, Smith also thinks that there's a hierarchy of sentiments for these civic ethics in terms of importance, and the first one is justice. And he calls that the main pillar. And why is that? Because society cannot exist among those who are at all times ready to hurt each other. Okay? So you have to have self-defense. Otherwise, society that's got to be there. Okay? By itself, though, not enough. In fact, the next thing he thinks we have to have for an advanced society, self-interest. The selfish passions, or the selfish passions and the self-interest that underlies them. Why is that? Because in a complex society in particular, we need each other's help, and they need our help. I used to have the best example, and now everybody knows what it is, but I used to, at this point, say, you guys know what hydraulic fracturing is, fracking? And everybody would go, no, never heard of it. I say, I know. You'd never heard of it until they made that stupid Gasline movie. But you never heard of it, but every one of you depended on it today. Somebody you never met who doesn't know you and doesn't even know you exist did work that you don't even know what it is, and you depended on it. How is self-love, or how is caring about others going to help you in that? They can't possibly even know who you are, and yet they're working for you. What guides it? Self-interest in the market. Given the market constraints, which are going to be related to that, given those market constraints, self-interest will help make this society work. That's fundamental. We need other people's help, but we don't know what they need. Or we need their help, but they don't know us. They need our help, but they don't know us. But looking at prices, we can be guided by self-interest to serve each other. Cool. Okay. Benevolence is helpless. What is that stupid song? Love is all you need? No way. Right? John Lennon said that, I think. Come on. That's not all you need. It won't hold society together. But it's also important. Beneficence is important. You do need that because you've got to care about other people. As Smith says, people who are ready to, if you didn't have that, you would be an opportunist where when you got the chance, you'd get other people. And that's not going to be a good society. That's not going to be a functional society either. Beneficence, you got to care about justice for others. And so, if we can get these things approximately right, then we've got a chance. And Smith thinks the commercial stage of society is the most hopeful of all, if we can curb our mercantilist rent-seeking tendencies that will threaten to undermine it. But if we can get this, if we can avoid that, then we have, in those stages, we just hit the point where if we can make it work, it's great. We will really have an extended order, a society that will be good for everybody. Okay, great. 5 minutes, the role of the state. Doesn't even take that long to talk about what he says here. The role of the state, obviously, I think, is not going to be major. The role of the state is this. He says it does not create society. The state facilitates society. Society is what people do for themselves, and the state then helps to further it and protect it and nurture it and help it, but it doesn't create it. It does all those things if it does it right. And so what government should do is enforce justice. And it should be impartial. Don't play favorites. Don't facilitate rent seeking. And it should be minimalist. Don't try to do everything. You can't. Individuals know better what's good for them than you do. No ruler overcomes the knowledge problem. You can't centrally plan. And he doesn't call it the knowledge problem, but he's got the idea that Colbert thinks he can run society, and it does not going to work. Each person that knows has been entrusted to himself because he knows best what he needs and what he can provide for others. So let that natural system of liberty function. And another thing he says, what's the role of a statesman? He said the most important thing is that, first of all, a statesman understand society is not a chessboard and that people aren't chess pieces to move around. Instead, be a little bit humble and limit yourself to setting up laws that keep your government in check so that you don't get carried away and that you do the things you're supposed to. And then Smith says the most dangerous thing of all is the man of system. What is the man of system? And that's the person who imagines that they can sit down and design an entire society and create it and push people around like they are pawns on a chessboard and have it work out. He says that's the most dangerous thing that we can face. Colbert is an example of that. But coming, before we're done with this course or the next course, we'll see other people who are men of system, and we'll see Karl Marx, and then we'll see Vladimir Lenin, and we'll see Joseph Stalin. And they literally believe that people are putty that they can engineer, and that that's what they will try to do. So contrasting ideas, these are the ones that Smith lays out. This really is foundational for things like new institutional economics. So, anyway, on that happy note, any questions? Okay. That's Smith on theory of moral sentiments. When we return, we're going to talk about Smith's economics. And that's, of course, what he's more famous for now. And we'll see how this sort of undergirds his ideas on economics. So go to the Praxis event, and I'll see you Thursday. Bring in your term paper topics or your term paper drafts, and see you later.